Hey everyone, it's incredible to have you all here. My name is Meghan. I am from India, but I've had an international upbringing, and I am a second year student majoring in social entrepreneurship. Growing up, my career interests have jumped around from astrophysics to journalism to visual arts to biology to acting and so much more before I arrived at the realization that I really want to pursue the brain and cognitive sciences. But if it weren't for all these jumps, I wouldn't have gone through the incredible process of exploration, which led me to identify the path that I'm most passionate about. For this, I thank my teachers through to from primary school through to university that have gotten me involved with my community and encouraged me to actively partake in experiments and experiences before I land on my final calling. Now, my calling might be different from other students that you've heard from today, but we have one thing in common as a generation: passion. Passion drives Gen Z. Whether that is passion for conserving the environment, passion for social justice, passion for activism, political engagement, or just the passion to do good. The fact that we can act on the basis of our passion, on the basis of values such as equality, sustainability, and mindful consumerism, that is a real privilege. And the reason we have this privilege is because our previous generations have worked hard to get us to a place where we can afford to put social impact over money alone. And as a generation that holds this honorary power, it is up to us to make choices that make people, planet, and profit equal priorities moving forward. But how is that possible? How can we make people, planet, and profit equally important? The answer is innovation. It's reshaping our global systems in ways never done before. Innovation is not futuristic. It's happening as we speak, and it's happening all around us. The most obvious instance being how humanity has collectively pivoted to overcome some of the hurdles posed by the pandemic. And much of it has created immense opportunity for even more innovation. Our next guest, Brendan Busteed, President, University Partners, and Global Head, Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan, is a notable innovator in the education sector. He's been named the top voice in education on LinkedIn, and his mission is to help US higher education adapt, grow, and thrive. It is my honor to invite Brandon to the stage today. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Megan, and nice to meet you here virtually. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to do that in person on campus at some point before you graduate and conquer the world. So, in any event, I'm delighted to be with everybody today, especially to be with many of my friends and colleagues at Lynn University. I have a bit of the luxury of working with the most innovative universities and university leaders in the country. And Lynn is certainly one of them. So it's been a pleasure to get to know the institution better, to help to be part of its growing success. And I'm a great admirer of all the things that it has been doing and the trajectory that it's on. So I was asked today to kind of round out things. Obviously, it's going to be a tough act to follow, many incredible presentations and rich subjects here. But to dive into what really is the value driver of college, right? What is the magic of this thing that we call college, right? This precious experience that the entire globe has looked up to and aspired to in many ways, in different shapes and forms. When you start to unpack it, right? What are the things that really matter as it relates to a college experience? Now, obviously, this is important for administrators and faculty to understand from the perspective of what they can do to improve the likelihood that these things happen for more students. It's really important also for students and their parents to understand, right? When we think about taking advantage of this precious opportunity, what are the things that matter most? And so that's what I'm going to dissect a little bit, following up on a lot of research that I led when I was previously at Gallup as the executive director of education and workforce development there. But there's certainly a lot of insights that segue into the work that I've been leading at Kaplan for the last 2.5 years. And before I dive into it, I just want to do a really broad 2-minute context setting, right? Because there are indeed a lot of headwinds facing higher education, headwinds that were here long before the pandemic. Enrollments in US colleges and universities have been on a decline now for 10 consecutive years. Public opinion polls about the confidence in higher education among the US general population have been waning over the last 5 or 6 years in particular. there's real doubt about the work readiness of college graduates among the various constituents that are surveyed about that topic, including doubts among students themselves to some degree. And this is all against the backdrop of a couple really important trends. One is that today's 18 to 24-year-olds, for example, are the least working generation in US history. That is, their reports of working an hour or more in a paid job in the past 2 weeks is the lowest it's been in the 60 years that that kind of measurement has taken place consistently in the United States. So you take a step back and say, all right, well, if we're not confident that college graduates are well prepared for success in the workplace, it's probably not surprising to know that one of those factors is just the simple fact that they're the least working generation. They have the least opportunity to try on different hats, so to speak, in terms of what kinds of work or jobs they might want to have. And the reason why I mention this is that there are many reasons why we value college, but the number one reason by a long distance is to get a good or better job. It is very much about improving one's career trajectory. And that's not just defined by how much money they make. That's a really simple measure of this. It's obviously much more rich and complex than that. It's also about whether people find meaningful work or purposeful work, right? Whether that work fits who they are, what their strengths and talents are. So it's against this backdrop that I want to talk about the value proposition of college. And this is so important, right? Because I think most people think about the value proposition of college through some very simple lenses, right? How much money is it going to cost me, right? Maybe to some degree, how much time is it going to take? How much student loan debt might I incur in the process? And how much money will I make when I graduate? Well, I'm not going to suggest those things aren't important, but I'll start with a really powerful finding based on research done by Nobel laureates that found that well-being, how people rate and evaluate their lives, doesn't increase over $75,000 a year in annual income. Now, what's important is that up to $75,000, yes, income matters for well-being, but after $75,000, statistically speaking, how much money you make has no bearing on how well you think things are going in your life, your overall livelihood or well-being. So it's against that kind of an insight that we start to unpack findings from what was the largest, and still is to this day, the largest representative study of college graduates in US history, what's been referred to as the Gallup-Purdue Index. This is a study that I helped lead and kick off in my time at Gallup, and is probably among the most cited studies on higher education in history at this point. And here were the interesting things, right? As we set out to do this study, we wanted to think about all the different aspects of college that may or theoretically may have moved the needle on life outcomes later. So the outcome variables that we were interested in measuring were the degree to which these graduates were thriving in their overall well-being later in life, and the degree to which they were engaged in the work that they were doing, whatever that work might have been. Now, the study measured things like whether you were employed full-time or part-time or unemployed. It measured things like annual household income, right? So those were parts of it. But then what we wanted to do is unpack all the aspects of those graduates' experiences that they had during college to try to understand which of those kinds of experiences had the biggest relationship with those outcomes later, right? Your well-being and your likelihood of being engaged in work. And of all the variables we looked at, and there were many, including institutional typology, for example, large public or private institutions, or small or residential, right? All kinds of different variables. What it boiled down to were 6 critical elements of the college experience that for graduates who hit the mark on these 6 aspects, it doubled their odds of thriving in their well-being throughout life, and it doubled their odds of being engaged in their work throughout life. These weren't effects that lasted a year or 5 years. They were literally lifelong relationships. So what I'm going to talk to you about, these 6, what the researchers that were involved in the project called the Big 6, they fall into 2 categories, right? So the 2 categories are what I call relationship rich education. And the second category is what I call work integrated education. So let me start with the first one of relationship rich experiences. What were they? What were the things that doubled your odds of being engaged and thriving later in life? Well, first of all, these graduates said that they strongly agreed to a question around whether they felt their professors cared about them as a person. Think first of all about the careful wording in that statement, right? And then on a 5-point scale of strongly agree to strongly agree is a strong statement, right? Like there's no doubt in your mind that that happened. When I say, you know, did you have professors who cared about you as a person? There's just no debate. It's like, yes. And you're not just thinking about one, because obviously that was referred to in the plural. Professors cared about me as a person. It also doesn't mean that every single professor you had, you felt that necessarily, but that it happened from more than one professor as part of your college experience. Now, here's the interesting thing. In qualitative research that we did as a follow-on to this project, when graduates strongly agreed to that item, we would ask them an open-ended question like, okay, well, what was it that made you feel that your professors cared about you as a person? And I wonder, maybe you guys can throw something in the chat, take a crack at what the most commonly referenced attribute of those professors was. Think about it, the professors who cared about you as a person, right? What was it that that made you feel that they cared? There was one thing, and somebody who's already answered it, Bruce nailed it, several others nailed it. They knew my name. They knew my name. And every time I talk about this, right, I'm stunned first by how low a bar or threshold that is, right? And also how important it is for an individual professor, any educator involved with students, a staff member, an administrator, right, to try to take the time to care to get to know their name. Now, it goes beyond that because these graduates would continue and say, well, yeah, they knew my name. They got to know me outside the classroom. Some would cite, you know, opportunities they had to have a lunch or dinner with them, right? But it was an expression of care and interest in who these students were. So that was the first one, right? That in thinking about my experience at my alma mater, I felt that the professors cared about me as a person. The second one was I had at least one professor who made me excited about learning. Now, this is slightly different, right? Because this is the professor that kind of inspired, you know, interest and a desire to learn in you. Well, it sounds like a really low bar, right? Because this question is, I had at least one professor who made me excited about learning. Here's the interesting thing. 60% of college graduates in the US strongly agreed to that question, which means that on the flip side, 40% didn't. In other words, 40% of all college graduates in the US didn't feel that they had at least one professor during their time in college who made them excited about learning. So you could argue, well, hey, 60% strongly agreeing sounds like a pretty good score. I would argue on the other side that the fact that 4 out of 10 are leaving, not hitting the mark on that, is a really big miss. Now, the third of these relationship-rich variables turned out to be the most important driver of long-term outcomes of all the things we studied. So don't misunderstand me. All 6 of these matter. All 6 of these double the odds that you're thriving in your well-being later and engaged in your work. But this one had the highest odds ratios. And this was the statement. Think about how many of you can strongly agree to this question and thinking back about your bachelor's degree college experience if you had one. I had a mentor who encouraged my goals and dreams. Now, for those of you who are thinking about that question in terms of how you respond, those who strongly agree, it's an instant reaction. None of you needed to debate it, right? If you're debating it going, well, maybe, kind of, sort of, it's a no, it's a maybe, it's not a definite. For those of you who were definite, snapped your fingers and went, absolutely. I'll tell you, the very first thing that popped into your mind was that person's name, right? Professor Blunt, Tony Brown, right? These were ones who were mentors to me in college. Joel Fleischman. I'm lucky and fortunate enough to have several that I consider mentors who encouraged my goals and dreams. Now, that's a very strongly worded statement, right? Mentor wasn't defined. It didn't say faculty member or staff person or upper class student. It could have been anybody, right? But somebody who got to know what you wanted to achieve, where you wanted to go in life. Well, to do that, you've got to ask students that kind of question. Brandon, what do you want to be someday? What's your passion? What's your interest? Where do you want to go? What do you want to accomplish, right? I have to ask that as a faculty member or a staff person or an administrator or a fellow student for that matter, before I can help understand how to push me along in a mentoring fashion. Well, here's the thing. Although it was the most important item of all the ones that were studied, only 2 out of 10 college graduates in the US strongly agreed to that item. So we have a whole bunch of room for improvement here. Now, as I've been talking about these things, many people instantly start to think about, well, what can universities do to improve the percentages of students and graduates then who have these experiences? What can faculty do? And that's certainly part of the lens. But you can turn this back to students and parents too, and you can say, hey, student, if you know these are the most important parts of college, right? Make sure that you don't miss out on hitting the mark on these things. Because of course, mentoring goes both ways. A student has to express interest in that kind of opportunity, right? They have to have conversations with professors. And it certainly helps if a professor reaches out and taps that person on the shoulder and starts to build that kind of relationship. But my point here is that we can also encourage students. Now, how do you do that? It's a simple thing. Any campus that you set foot on in America, start asking students, hey, who are the amazing professors here, right? Who are the super mentors? It's no secret. It might not be published on the website in a simple list of the best professors, but you start asking around the second you enroll, right? Start asking about the professors that are, changing the lives and thinking of students. And by the way, they might not be in courses or majors that you were intending to be part of. I made an effort when I was a student to try and get to every one of these kinds of professors as possible. Now, I didn't know anything about this study until years later, but some instinct in me said, it doesn't matter what that person's teaching. If they have a reputation for being an incredible teacher, an incredible mentor, you better try and get into those classes. So there are things that all of us can do to improve the likelihood of hitting the mark on these things. So that's the quick summary of the relationship-rich elements, right? The first 3 of this big 6. I'm now going to talk about the work-integrated aspects, the additional 3, and then I'm just going to leave it open for Q&A for the rest of the time. So we're going to have plenty of time. So this is your heads up to think about a bunch of questions, and we're going to let you drive the conversation from this point forward. So here are the work-integrated ones. Here's the statement. And again, think about, whether you strongly agree to these statements. I worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. Here's the fascinating thing about this one. To me, I would think that every college graduate in the United States would strongly agree to this item, right? Just like you didn't have a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. It turns out that it's just less than a third who strongly agree to this item. So I sit back and I look at that kind of research and I think to myself, well, what were the other 2/3 doing, right? Taking pop quizzes and writing 5-page papers all the way through college? Maybe. And you say, okay, well, is this the fault of universities, or potentially is it students who are trying to seek courses that don't involve hard capstone projects, right? Maybe not because they're lazy. That's actually not the reason when we started to do qualitative interviews about students who avoided those kinds of classes. What was the top reason why they avoided them? They didn't want to get a bad grade, because they're thinking to themselves that the grades are the most important thing, right? The grades matter more than anything else. And that's just not the truth when it comes to looking at well-being and engagement later in life. So I'm not suggesting you don't want to try and get good grades. You absolutely do. But when it comes to a trade-off between trying to take a challenging course that involves a capstone project, right, or a long-term project, the fear of potentially getting a bad grade or working hard in that should be drowned out by the fact that that is one of the most meaningful experiences for your development and long-term success that you could possibly have. Here's the second one within the work integrated experience category. It was this statement. I was extremely involved in an extracurricular activity or organization, which, by the way, was different than a long list of items we asked students about. Which of the following extracurricular activities were you involved in, right? Check, 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 all kinds of different things. here's the interesting point. It wasn't simply saying that you were involved in an extracurricular activity that moved the needle. It was whether separately you strongly agreed to that statement about being extremely, deeply, meaningfully engaged in at least one of those extracurricular activities. And this is one that I give a lot of advice to students and parents about, right? Because we have encouraged a generation to, we even have an expression for this, pad your resume, right? Listing all kinds of different honor societies and associations you were a member of. And I look at that, and by the way, the average student lists between 15 and 17 different affiliations and extracurricular activities on their resume when they graduate. I look at that and I wonder, well, I wonder what that came at the cost of, right? Being deeply, meaningfully engaged in one of them over a lasting period of time? Perhaps. The point here is not to discourage students from exploring lots of different things or being involved in multiple activities, but to encourage them to sink their teeth into one of them in a really meaningful way over a long period of time. That's what starts to move the needle on success and well-being later in life and in work. And the final one, and this is one of my favorite ones to talk about, was this statement. I had a job or an internship where I was able to apply what I was learning in the classroom. Now, we also asked a separate question. Did you have a paid job during college? Yes or no? Well, it turns out that if you said yes to that question, it has no relationship with work success later in life. I'm not saying it was a bad experience. You earned some money. You were able to use that money to pay some bills. So from that perspective, a big win. But simply having had a job during college is not what matters. Go back to the statement that I read to you. It's whether you had a job or an internship where there was some synergy with what you were learning, that there was an interaction between what you were learning in more of the traditional classroom sense and what you were doing as part of that work experience. That's where the magic really comes to life. So universities like Lynn University, for example, that have all kinds of programs that integrate work or internship or volunteer opportunities with academic reflection and programs, right? That's what really makes this come to life, where the theoretical and the practical merge together, right? Where students get hands-on experience and they think about that experience, what it means for them, what it means for others. So that rounds up the three work integrated aspects of the Big Six. And I hope this has been helpful and insightful. I'm just going to pause here and open it up to Q&A, and we'll continue the discussion from there.
Brandon, I'm going to send you some of the questions that are being sent through our chat. The first one is, can you talk more about the study, when it was completed, and is it still ongoing?
Yeah, thanks. So it's ongoing in a way, right? So I'm no longer at Gallup, but my colleagues who I worked on with this study are still leading it, and they are continuing to do an annual survey, an annual representative survey of college graduates in the US that builds on the database, right, which they've essentially been doing annually since 2014. That initial 2014 study surveyed over 30,000 college students, and at a representative sampling level, you know, you could get these insights with an N of 1,000. The reason why 30,000 was selected was so that the research could be broken by types of institutions, by the majors that students majored in, right? So there's all kinds of fine-tuned nuances that go into great depth, right? Cutting that data by race, a whole bunch of other variables. So yes, the study is essentially ongoing as an annual survey. They continue to add questions that weren't asked in previous years. And then the overall data set continues to build because the core items of measuring well-being and workplace engagement, for example, have been essentially been embedded in it every year. So yes, I encourage you to go to the Gallup website. Purdue University has put a lot of the research up on their website. And again, Googling Gallup Purdue Index will get you, quite a few of those insights.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Next question is, how do you suggest high school students evaluate possible schools for how they provide these 6 experiences?
Yeah, oh, that's a super question. So I started to hint at it a little bit, right? But, you have the opportunity to do the classic tour of a college campus, right? And in that tour, you can go outside the lines in terms of the kinds of questions you ask, right? So every university will say they offer students internship opportunities, for example. ask a little bit of a tougher question. What percent of students have an internship here before they graduate? What kinds of programs and majors is an internship required or an integrated part of, right? Can you tell me about some of the programs that link classroom-based discussion and reflection with summer opportunities in leadership, for example, right? So I think those are important pieces. And then I think you can ask questions about the culture of mentoring and faculty support at the university. Here's an interesting insight, right? That graduates from Research One universities, major research universities, were actually among the lowest of all graduates in saying they had professors who cared about them as a person or having mentors. Now, what's interesting about that is you say, well, why would that be, right? Well, one of the things we think is linked to that is the fact that a lot of the professors there have a major research agenda, right? They're publishing, they're trying to write grants. And I'm not suggesting that they don't care about students or aren't good mentors, but they have major goals that they're incentivized to achieve. And a lot of them actually aren't about classroom teaching and mentorship. So there are some differences by type of institution. Another one that many people will not like to hear is that graduates of the Ivy League were really low on those items too. And again, if you step back for a second and think about it, the Ivy League has recruited largely some of the world's best researchers. And you know what? Some of these folks have contributed to things like the development of vaccines for COVID-19, right? So certainly contributing major things to the world, but not necessarily the same thing as being dedicated world-class classroom teachers and mentors to students. So the simple point here is that there weren't as big a difference by type. I mean, I mentioned some of the small ones here. It's more important to kind of evaluate that institution and ask questions about the degree to which faculty are really motivated to do that, right? That there's a culture of caring and a culture of mentoring. Asking those questions, you'll start to get some really interesting answers. Ask them of current students. If you're a parent, ask it of parents who have current students at the institution, and ask the institution those questions in various ways.
That's most insightful. Thanks, Brandon. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'll try and move through them pretty quickly. One of our colleagues has asked, they've long maintained that one's career path is more heavily influenced by extracurricular rather than curricular experience. This is because one moves from a theoretical to a practical mode, and one learns more about oneself in the latter. Does this make sense?
Well, it largely makes sense, right? Think about the things I've touched upon, work integrated learning. But by the way, as I mentioned, it wasn't just the fact that you've had a job, right? Like I am a huge proponent of work experience, even if it was crappy work experience, because it helps somebody understand what they do and don't like. It gives them a perspective on what it means to work, right? To observe that job, not just to perform it. I remember one of my first jobs was as a cashier at Ponderosa Steakhouse. And you know, it was essentially a minimum wage job. I was making $4.45 an hour and, you know, typing into the cash registry each day. Well, if I just thought about my job as that sole function, it wasn't a really interesting job. But in the middle of that, I remember watching the style of the manager, right? And, you know, following the cues of what his leadership style was. And I kind of observed employees, you know, the single mom who was working there, the person who had to take 2 buses and then walk 1.5 miles to get to work, understanding the needs of all these different people who are part of the same workplace. My point is that we can learn from all work experiences. We learn from extracurricular activities. I think we've devalued the learning we can get from work. But what it also tells us in terms of this Gallup-Purdue Index research is that it has to be linked to our academic thinking, right? The enrichment of thinking about theory, right? Applying that theory, having some hands-on work to try to, you know, iterate on an idea, get feedback from a work group or whatever it might be. Is so I really encourage the synergy of these things, right? Whether it's an extracurricular activity and a leadership course that a student takes, right? Those are incredible things to kind of weave together. A summer opportunity to volunteer, right? Which is buttressed by a spring semester preparatory course and followed up by a fall reflection program. Those are the things that make it come to life. So I hate going to like the either or part of this, like where it's like, oh, it's either skill-based vocational training or it's the liberal arts, right? Or it's purely academic versus work. we can't pit these things against one another anymore. We've got to blend them together. It's a both and.
Thanks. Brandon, one of the struggles that many of our folks that are with us today from the counseling community often struggle with when dealing with students and parents is the rankings game. And this institution or that institution isn't on the latest US News and World Report ranking, or it's ranked this level compared to that level. So the question is, a lot of parents and students use rankings to make decisions on where to apply and enroll, but those rankings don't factor in the big six that you've just talked about. How can we help move the conversation to what really matters with students and parents?
Well, look, I feel your frustration, right? You know, there has been a proliferation of rankings. Obviously, a lot of people cue off of the granddaddy of them all with U.S. News and World Report, and you've made a very straightforward observation, which I'm surprised more consumers, right, prospective parents and students don't pay attention to, which is that if you look at the criteria used in those rankings, it's a lot of stuff that, like, from the perspective of the research I led, has no bearing on the quality of the experience for students. Okay, so you can look at the selectivity. What does that tell you? It doesn't tell you it's the best university in the world in terms of teaching. It tells you that it was the most selective in terms of hiring, selecting students who, you know, performed well on standardized tests and got good grades in high school, right? You know, endowment size is one of the factors. There's actually, this is another stunning insight. I've written an article in Forbes about it, but there's no relationship between the price of a college and the alumni ratings of quality later, right? So this myth that the more expensive the institution, the better it must be, we've gotten caught up on that. Now, there are expensive institutions that are worth every penny, but it also tells you there are inexpensive ones that are very high quality, and on the flip side, expensive ones that don't deliver on quality. So overall, it's a wash, right? But I think, you know, the rankings are going to be a tough thing to escape from because we love a good ranking. Everybody loves to pay attention to that. But the reality is, you know, if you caught my drift on the Research One universities in the Ivy League being among the lowest on these big six, right? Those are institutions that are up there on the top of these rankings lists, right? Because they're prestigious. They have the best researchers in the world. They're the oldest universities in the world. So they've just frankly been around the longest, right? So these are things that we have to try to fight against to some degree. Now, I'm not going to suggest that, you know, hey, these brands don't matter. They do to some degree, right? To say you have a Harvard degree compared to a university whose name you may not recognize, you know, that certainly has some cachet. But on the flip side, I have to tell you, you know, there's an increasing resistance to the idea of elitism in this country in many ways, right? And I know a lot of employers, just a simple example, who won't hire graduates from some of the most elite universities because, you know, they think they're prima donnas, right? And I'm generalizing here. Obviously, this isn't the case for the vast majority of students, but that's the negative side of the perceptions of prestige and quality. But I think the simple question around rankings, I have not seen a ranking yet that has criteria worth its weight in terms of really getting all worked up over whether somebody gets into it or not, right? I think the more important things are the guidance I've given you, right? Evaluate each of these universities based on the degree to which these big six elements are happening. And you can detect that they're happening by the way the students talk about the experience, by the way faculty or parents of students talk about the experience. There's a bunch of gems out there. And as I mentioned, right, Lynn University to me is one of those gems. And anybody who visits the campus will easily start to discover that. So look, I think we need to get over our obsession with rankings. I think we need to get over our obsession with selectivity. I'm encouraged by institutions like Arizona State University, for example, who are now becoming elite, not because of being less selective, but because of actually opening their doors to more and more students in different ways. And so there are some changes and positive trends in higher ed on this point, but the simple one is just don't get worked up over the rankings.
I think that is definitely sound advice, and I'm sure music to many of our counselors' ears today, because I know that they are peppered on a regular basis about the rankings. And you have institutions like Lynn that don't always fit on some of these rankings. And yet we feel that we provide a sound and solid education that is really fitting for many students. So I think your remarks there will be noted by many of our colleagues today. Talking about Arizona State and some of the great things that they are doing, a question comes in that says, it seems as if these important factors are more easily pursued and achieved in smaller to mid-sized colleges. How do we advise students who are going off to larger university settings?
Well, look, the first thing I would encourage you to think about is the old expression, don't judge a book by its cover, right? There are a lot of people that run to assume that large scale means lesser quality, or that large scale means less of a personal touch. And although, there certainly is reason to believe that that's the case, right? I'll give you one that will just blow you away. After this big national study that Gallup did, right? The Gallup Purdue Index, we got hired by hundreds of universities to measure these alumni outcomes for their own alumni, right? To be able to compare their alumni to this national benchmark to see how they were doing. And I mean, I can't give you the list of all the universities that hired Gallup to do this. Many of them publish their own reports publicly, so you can kind of find them out there. But many really well-known institutions, top-ranked, prestigious institutions on the list, and a smattering of all kinds of different ones. Well, the institution that had the highest score on alumni saying they had mentors who encouraged their goals and dreams. Remember that one, the most important one I talked about? See, the image we have when we think of a question like that is like, oh, small, private, liberal arts university, right? They must be killing it. Well, many of them are doing very well on that item for sure. But the institution that, to this day, at least, in the time that I was involved at Gallup, had the highest measure on that was an adult-only, entirely online university. And when I first saw that, right, like we were all blown away, like, could this, really be possible? They were 3 times higher than the national average. So a little over 60% of their graduates strongly agreed they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams. Now you say, how is that possible in an adult-only online university? Well, the second I learned about their advising model, it started to make a lot of sense. So for example, in the model with this university, they assigned an advisor to a student from the second they matriculated all the way through their point of graduation. And it was the same person. The other unique attribute was that they actually met weekly, every week. Now, they were doing this on chat, on IM, on Zoom, on Google Hangout, right? Whatever format they wanted to connect in. Sometimes these were short 15-minute check-ins, other times they were longer, but the same person was, if I was a student at this institution, my advisor from the time I matriculated to the time I graduated, and I connected with that person weekly. Now that I say that, you can probably understand why such a high percentage of these graduates say they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams. They built a very meaningful relationship. So I don't want to suggest that, online is the way to go, but this is an example of a highly scaled online university. It's reaching roughly 100,000 in enrollment right now. And they are absolutely crushing it on this metric of mentorship. Now, you step back to the primary question. I think it's a lot about the incentives and the degree to which the institution has been purposeful in investing in these things, right? So I mentioned Research One universities, all kinds of incentive and pressure for faculty there to research and publish and get grants, right? And all of that, priority-wise, essentially comes before students. Now, a lot of people don't want to hear me say that, right? And especially, Research One universities, but that's the incentive model that they've chosen to invest in largely. So now you show me an institution that has a stated purpose of mentoring students, guiding them through shepherded, mentored research projects, right? Making sure that that's a requirement embedded in every degree, not just a small percentage who might hit the mark because of a particular program they took. Those are where you will see the game changers. And again, that stuff doesn't show up in the rankings. We come full circle to that initial question where, we're a bit on our own to evaluate these things. but they're very easy to evaluate when you start to look for it.
I think that's the beauty of American higher education, with 2,800 four-year universities, 4,000 universities, including our two-year institutions. Roughly 3.7 million, I think it is, Brandon, going off to college every year.
Yeah.
There's so many wonderful options for students. And I sometimes feel for our counselors that are with us today, because actually trying to navigate that landscape is really difficult, because there are definitely some diamonds in the rough, and there are those institutions that have surfaced to the top that everyone is familiar with, that household name. You mentioned a lot about mentors earlier on, and in your remarks there about ASU. There's a couple more questions about mentors. One in particular here that says, do you have any data about the mentors that were cited in your study that you referenced? I encourage my students to seek such a person and tell them that they could find that in a professor, administrator, cafeteria staff, any adult on campus. Curious about the data and your additional thoughts on mentoring.
Yeah, super question. I'm glad you asked it, because we did do a lot of follow-up on that, right? So for the graduates who had mentors, we started doing follow-up questions about, who was that, not by like name, Brandon Busteed, but was that a faculty member? Was that a staff member? Was it an administrator? Was it an upper class student? Was it a parent or family member? I mean, we really explored a broad group. Was it a coach? There were a lot of interesting findings there. First and foremost, professors, faculty were the largest source of mentoring among students, right? So no doubt that's the largest source of mentorship, but mentorship came from every angle, right? So smaller percentages of students would note a staff person, or, student affairs staff person, a counselor. They would note upper class students. They would note a family member. They would note a coach. I was kind of surprised, this is an interesting one, that student athletes actually weren't any more likely to cite their coach as a mentor, which was bizarre to me. I was a college athlete and I had a coach, Al Bueller, who was an incredible mentor. I would have thought that, athletes would be off the charts on mentorship and more likely to cite their coach. Not exactly the case, right? So anyway, the point is, here was the really empowering part of the study. It didn't matter who that mentor was, right? There weren't varying degrees of efficacy between student mentors or staff mentors or faculty members. It's just simply, if you said, strongly agree, I had a mentor who encouraged my goals and dreams, that more than doubled the odds of you thriving later in life, right? So what this says is, it's not just a job that we heap on the shoulders of faculty, right? And oh, by the way, if you're a student, it doesn't just mean that you're the mentee. It means that you also have an opportunity to potentially be a mentor to other students, right? Especially underclassmen or those who are very different in terms of their background and experience, right? So this is where I always encourage kind of thinking about, what does a culture of mentoring really mean? Culture of mentoring is something where it happens as part of the, the day-to-day life. It's part of the way that faculty think about why I signed up to come to this university, right? Like, I came here because this is a university that does value classroom teaching and mentoring, and I want to play a role in that. So, the mentoring insights were really powerful. Interestingly enough, too, there weren't huge differences by race when you looked within predominantly white institutions, for example, institutions that are predominantly Caucasian student enrollments. There were some fascinating findings, though, when we looked at data from graduates of historically Black colleges and universities, for example. So Black graduates from HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, were several times more likely to say things like they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams than Black graduates from other types of colleges and universities. So there's a lot more to unpack there, but there are some really powerful examples of where we know for students from underserved communities and backgrounds, right? Students of different races, that it matters a lot to see faculty and staff who look like you, who have a similar background with you, right? And those are things that I think we all need to pay more and more attention to, especially in the backdrop of the incredible and painful year that the U.S. has had around race relations, with companies and universities redoubling their efforts around equity and access and inclusiveness. Higher ed still has a lot of work to do on this, and I think it's evidenced in the fact that when you see the kind of performance that HBCUs have for Black students, you realize that we can do a better job here. So, so thanks for the additional question on mentoring. The powerful part is that anybody can be a mentor, not just faculty. And so we need to think much more expansively about our definition of mentoring.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back to what you originally had said, right? About students just wanting to feel that they were cared for and that someone actually knew their name. And whether that's a mentor, whether it's a faculty member, whether it's a staff member, people look at professionals on a college campus as just older adults. And do you care for me? Do you know my name? I think which your research has shown that makes a huge difference. Just going back to that study, Brandon, there's a question here in your former role. How does your work correlate to the National Survey of Student Engagement, and how does it differ? Do you either provide rankings by campus? And the person that asked the question just said former opinion research analyst here. So
awesome. Well, so I'm glad there's mention of what many people refer to as NSE, the National Survey of Student Engagement, which has been running for many years, and that's a survey that's run of current college students, right? So the Gallup-Purdue Index study was a study of graduates, but in many ways, in the NSE studies, they talk about what they call high impact practices. And if you look at those high impact practices, they align very much with the big six from the Gallup-Purdue Index, right? Long-term projects, work integrated learning, opportunities to do mentored research, right? And this is an interesting one too, because you say, okay, it sounds really cool to be involved in research with a professor, but think of the differences, right? Think of the typical research project that an undergraduate student might get involved in. And I don't mean to be, flippant here with this example, but a lot of them, it's cleaning out Petri dishes and entering data into an Excel spreadsheet, right? Like that's their research with the professor. Well, that's very different than potentially being involved in the actual, hypothesis development and actually helping conduct and design the experiment and, running analyses on the data. And so my point is, right, you got to dig deeper into like, what is that experience? So it's one thing to just throw undergrads into some, really menial tasks as part of a research project versus actually designing projects where they have a meaningful contribution to it. So I just think, it's about digging beneath the surface here. When someone says, oh, I get to do a research project, like, what does that really mean, right? And those are ways that I think we can all be kind of better consumers of this precious thing called college. So.
Thanks. We have tons of questions coming through, and I'm trying to align them with some of your remarks. And I think this one is very fitting just on your research comments there. We have a question that's come through here that says, Research One College's market that every student can do research as undergrads. How do we help students assess if that is actually true?
Well, hopefully I sort of answered that in my previous question, right? So for example, in the study, there wasn't as much publication about null findings, right? So in other words, a question we asked that had no relationship with well-being and workplace engagement later, but some of the null findings were actually a big deal. And one of them was, we asked the question. Now keep in mind, this is graduates reflecting on their undergraduate experience. So there would be separate research to reflect if they had gone on to graduate school, right? To have them reflect on their graduate school experience. So I'll draw a little distinction here. But for undergraduates reflecting on their bachelor's degree experience, we asked the question, did you work on a research project with a professor? And those who said they did, it had no relationship with outcomes later, right? So I'm not saying it was a bad thing, right? But it did not move the needle on long-term outcomes. Now, you're like, well, how could that be? I mean, I've said that in speeches to higher ed audiences, and people have thrown rotten fruit at me, right? Because it's just not a popular thing for anybody to hear. And it wouldn't be in the context of this, the R1 universities, putting that out there as a really big deal. But when you start to think about it, there's a big difference. So think about the question in the study that does work. I worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. Well, I'm sure that many of those long-term projects were done with the support of a professor, right? So it's not that the research part didn't work, it's that my thesis is most research projects that undergraduates get invited into, they're doing really menial tasks, right? The proverbial cleaning out petri dishes and entering data into a spreadsheet function. Now, those who do research at a graduate level, it's a totally different ballgame. So I've heard a lot of people, and I actually think to some degree this is reflected a little bit in the Gallup Purdue Index findings, right? Go to Research One universities for graduate school, because there's little doubt that they're doing some of the, the world's leading research at those institutions. But I actually am skeptical that undergrads are getting full access to that. Now, again, I'm generalizing by data, right? That kind of gives me an aggregate national perspective. What I know from all this research is that there are pockets within institutions that are absolutely outperforming others, that there are certain institutions doing a good job, which is to say, there are R1s out there who are doing a bang up job on these things. And even in some of the research, I'll just give you this as a hint. I won't name the institution, but a large Research One institution, they had about 9 different departments or colleges. And if you looked at the outcomes from graduates from each of those departments within the university, there were very different outcomes, right? So, and in this particular institution, there was one department, there was one school where the graduates were just off the charts on some of their outcome data. And if you go and look at that school, right, in the context of the larger university, you just kind of do a deep dive on that school, you would have found dynamic dean, a dynamic leadership team, faculty who are all about the student experience, right? And so there are pockets within universities, right? Think honors colleges or certain departments that are just outstanding. Here's a really simple litmus test. Do you feel the energy when you walk in that building? Do you feel the energy when you visit a classroom? Do you sense the energy from the students that are in that major or program, right? These are not things that are hidden. Like I said, they're not on the website. They might not be listed on the rankings list, but they're also not hidden either.
Thanks. The folks on the call with us today, Brandon, play a very instrumental and pivotal role in guiding young adults on where to go to college and universities, and really have a very influential role in the well-being of that student while they're in high school. Question that comes through that could potentially really help our counselors is any ideas on personal skills, experiences high school students can work on to better prepare them to build these relationships that you've talked about today in their respective colleges or universities that they ultimately matriculate to?
Yeah, I mean, look, part of it is helping students get comfortable with, reaching out, asking questions of teachers and faculty, right? Feeling comfortable doing that. If they offer things like office hours, or if they say, please see me after class if you have any additional questions, like start to build a behavior and a comfort level with doing that. Because I think a lot of students are reticent to engage in that way, right? Whether they're just nervous or scared or intimidated, there's all kinds of different reasons, or they just think it doesn't matter. All I got to do is get good grades. Why do I need to, engage in discussion outside of class or anything beyond that, right? But I think we need to encourage them to build some comfort and a behavior around that, to think about, right? Who are the teachers and faculty? If I have the ability to select them, right? In college, you get a little bit more choice about the classes you select, right? To be doing some homework on those that have this, an outstanding reputation for being amazing teachers and mentors to students. Those are all things that are important. But like I said, it goes both ways. And you could have the most amazing mentoring professor in the world, but as a student, if you don't engage in that conversation, if you don't take advantage of the time that he or she is willing to give, then you're missing out on a really big opportunity. And it's also, a bit of my point about being brave, right? Select some of the hard courses that require long-term projects that really stretch you, that might require a capstone type project, right? Even a thesis. Like these are kind of scary and hard things to go do, but to know that in doing them, they're going to actually have a better outcome for you later in life. Like that's the encouragement. But it's a little different than what we say now, right? Like even I hear a lot of well-intentioned parents, and I'm sure many of you have heard the same, or you're a parent who's done this, right? They say to their kids, your job is to get good grades and test scores, so I don't want you to work. And of course, this is in the assumption that this is a family who's who the student doesn't have to work, right? A lot of well-intentioned parents will emphasize the grades and test scores over a work experience, when in actuality, right, I'll give you a really good one. Employers would rather hire a B student who's had an internship than an A student who hasn't had one. So it doesn't say they don't care about grades, but they're willing to make a trade-off of a whole grade point level to see a valuable work experience, right? Or that they have a project that they can show or demonstrate, a portfolio they've created as part of the work that they've done, right? They did their own documentary or whatever it might be. Those things matter a lot, right? And if we want to call those some of the qualitative aspects of high school or college, so be it. But those things really matter. And so giving students more encouragement around that, helping them be a little bit brave around it, because right now you're swimming against the sea of grades and test scores are the end all be all, and rankings are the end all be all, right? We have to resist those two things.
Brandon, we're out of time, but I've got one more question that I would like to ask. Unfortunately, I can't get to all of them, but we know the demographics of students that are attending university are changing. We're seeing more students from lower socioeconomic families, more underrepresented students, and more first-generation students, which is really wonderful for us as institutions to be attracting a more diverse group of students to learn in our classroom and share their knowledge and ideas. As you talked about students trying to navigate respective institutions, whether it's R1 institutions, large public, small private, for those populations that may not be as well accustomed and have the wherewithal in a home environment to be well prepared to make those meaningful connections, what tidbits, what bits of information can you share with our counselors to help those populations when they get onto our respective college campuses to make use of those opportunities and resources that are available to them at respective institutions around the country?
Look, it's not easy. I was just talking with somebody the other day who's a career advisor at a college level and works at a campus that has a very large population of Pell eligible students, and he's had to change almost everything he does in terms of giving them career advice, because he said, I used to start telling them about the importance of networking. And he said, telling a student from, a family that, comes from, the bottom quintile of economic income, right, to go network. Well, it's almost like, what does that mean, right? I mean, they have limited social capital. They have a limited view of the types of professions that are out there by way of, a very narrow set of understanding of jobs, et cetera. And so, it's just not helpful advice, right? But so I think, you step back and you say, universities are very well intentioned in terms of trying to make sure they're doing a better job serving students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, serving students from underserved communities in general, serving underrepresented minorities in higher education. Still not doing a great job, right? And in some places, maybe a poor job. But my simple advice is to encourage those students to just find somebody that they can build a relationship with, right? It might not be the guidance counselor at the campus, right? It might not be a faculty member, right? It could be a staff person, right? But to just make that effort to find somebody that they're comfortable building a relationship with. And I believe fundamentally that somebody will help them connect to the other resources that are available, right? But it's just starting there. So if it's not the classic resource of, hey, go to your academic advisor and they'll fix it. I remember I had a horrible academic advisor, and it was a total waste of my time, right? So to assume that would have been the path to my success in college just wasn't the case. So that's what I would say about it. Find somebody that they can build a relationship with, whoever that is. And for those of you who are interested in following some more of my insights, I write frequently for Forbes, so find me on Forbes. I comment a lot on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. No, I haven't written a book. I saw one of those questions, but maybe one of these days I will. It was a pleasure to be with all of you, and I wish you the best in your work. I know you have your hands full, and you're certainly doing very, very important work for students and for our country. So thank you very much.